Now, when we talk about our biodiversity, if you remember, we had said that biodiversity, we had basically said that biodiversity, right? We had said biodiversity was the variation of species found in a habitat. And we had said that biodiversity can be measured using two things: the number of different species in an area, which we had termed as species richness. And the second thing was the relative abundance of each species. Now, how are you going to know the number of species in any area? Okay, you and me, we are studying a particular habitat, we're studying the rainforest, okay? Or we're inside a meadow and we're studying about some flowers. So for those flowers, you and I, you're like, okay, miss, for us to assess the biodiversity of the areas, one, we need to take a look at what are the different number of species. Okay. Then another thing that we have to look at, miss, is how many number do we have of each species, right? So the distribution should be even. That's the good thing. So how now, miss, how can you and I measure? How can you and I find out what is the number of organisms of a species, right? What are we going to do? So for that, we have different methods. There is one method that you are going to study in IGCSE, and later on when you do your A levels, you're going to study a few more methods that are used. Okay. Now, the method that we use for measuring, okay, the method used to measure the number of organisms in an area is the quadrant method. Okay, we use a method that is known as the quadrant method. Obviously, like I said before, you are going to study more various methods in your A levels, but in your IGCSE, you need to know about the quadrant method. What is the quadrant method? Okay, what they are able to do is that now, if you and I are studying a meadow, you and I are obviously not going to be able to count every single living organisms in that area, right? We can't do that. You and I cannot count every single living organism in the area, right? So what you and I are going to have to do is that we are going to have to use a small area. Like if we have a huge meadow, so you will say, okay, miss, let's do one thing. Let's take this one area of the meadow and we will, we will count from this one area. So what are you doing? You are doing sampling, or you're using a sample. Okay, you're using a sample. You're not actually counting the number of area or number of organisms in the entire meadow. You have decided to take a small area of the meadow, and in that one area, you will count the number of organisms. So those number of organisms are not the total number of organisms in the area, but they will give you an idea about the number of organisms, right? So we use the term sample. Sample is not just specific to the topic of ecology. Sample is a scientific term. So for example, you are doing a study about people who suffer from heart disease. Okay. Now, you are not going to take every single person who suffers from heart disease in your study. You will take a small portion of those people. So you're using a sample, right? So that is what we mean by sample. Sample is simply uh, a smaller representative of a population. So if we take a smaller representative of a population, that's sample, a small portion of the population. Okay. Now, how do we do our how do we actually do sampling in for our ecology? Okay. For our ecology, if I want to do sampling, okay, so sampling is done using a quadrant. What is a quadrant? I'm so sorry, I keep saying quadrant. It's quadrant, not A-N-T. It is R-A-T, not quadrant, quadrant. Okay, it's a quadrant. Now, a quadrant is actually a small square made of wood, plastic, or metal. Okay. Now, what you are actually going to do is that it has, it is, it is divided into smaller squares. This is what it's going to look like. So this is our grassy area. Okay. This is my grassy area. Now, in this grassy area, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to place a quadrant. Okay. This quadrant, this is a metal square, okay, or a wood square, or a made of, plastic, doesn't matter. This quadrant is usually divided into multiple small squares like this. Okay. Now, what you do is that you follow a method that we call random sampling. Random sampling, what does that mean? To explain that, let's go back to our example of the people who you are studying, the people who study from heart disease. Now, when you are taking the people into your study, when you are taking the patients in your study, you will choose those patients randomly. You are not going to choose them selectively. You're not going to be like, no, I want this particular person who has smoking in his history. Or I want this particular person who, has like a sedentary lifestyle. Doesn't matter. You are always going to opt for random sampling. Whatever your criteria is, you are going to say, I'm going to choose people randomly for my study, right? Same thing we're going to do over here. What are you going to do? You are going to choose any random square, okay? After you choose a random square, you are going to count the number of organisms. So for example, you and I are counting flowers. You'll randomly choose a square. After randomly choosing a square, sorry, I meant randomly choosing a square. I meant randomly choose an area. In this entire meadow, you are not going to say, oh, I want to go over to that area where there happen to be a lot of flowers. No, you're not going to do it like that. To place your quadrant, you are going to place the quadrant randomly. You're not going to place your quadrant in a specific area where you can see there are a lot of flowers. That introduce bias. What is bias? Bias is you are doing your study, okay? You are studying a new drug that will help people with blood pressure, let's say. Now, if you know which patient is getting the blood pressure medication, which patient is getting your medication, you are more likely to report the results um, in more likely to report the results in a way that benefits you, right? You'll be like, oh, you'll be biased because you'll think it's my medicine, it's obviously going to work. So when you report the results, they might not be 100% accurate. Similarly, if you do not use random sampling, what will happen? It will introduce bias. If you go ahead and you place your quadrant in an area selectively, that this is an area filled with flowers, I'll do my study here, that's not accurate. Okay. So first of all, you'll choose an area randomly. That's known as random sampling. After you have chosen an area randomly, you will record the number of organisms in all of the squares. Okay. How many flowers in square number 1? How many in square number 2? How many in square number 3? Like so. Okay. After that, what are you going to do? You are going to total up all of the numbers. Okay. You are going to total up all of the numbers. And after you total up the numbers, you can then calculate the average and get the idea. Okay. So first of all, you have to make sure you do random sampling, right? The area where the quadrant is placed is chosen randomly. Okay. Then you have to make sure that you will count the number of organisms in each square and then add them up to add them up and calculate average to calculate average per meter square, right? So you'll calculate it per meter square. That this was, let's say this quadrant was 4 meters per square. So you calculated the average and the average you got was 5 organisms per meter square, right? Like that. So that's how you're going to go ahead and you're going to report the results. So this is one of the methods that we have, the quadrant method. Okay. This is one of the methods that we have that we can use to calculate or determine what is the number of species in any area, right? Making sense? Any confusion in this?
No.
All right. Now, when we this is how you figure out the number of organisms in any given area. Now, other than the quadrant method, okay, what is another important thing that we have to discuss? Another important thing that you and I have to discuss is pyramids. Is the 1 second. Is our ecological pyramid. What are ecological pyramids? You and I are studying a ecosystem. We are studying a food web. Okay. Now we want to represent the amount of organism at each trophic level. So how many producers do we have? How many consumers do we have? How many primary consumer? What is the number of secondary consumer? And we make a pyramid out. Okay. That is known as an ecological pyramid. Now, in an ecological pyramid, we can have various options. Okay. So your scientist can try to study a pyramid by looking at different things. Okay. Scientists can make a pyramid by taking a look at the numbers of the organisms. It is called pyramid of organisms. Okay. Oops, sorry. Pyramid of numbers, not organisms. Pyramid of numbers. What happens? What happens in a pyramid of numbers? The scientists are going to measure the number of organisms in each trophic level. Okay, they're going to measure number of organisms at each trophic level. So for example, let's take a really easy example. Okay, let's say that we have grass. Okay, that grass is being eaten by grasshoppers. Those grasshoppers are being eaten by frogs, and the frogs are being eaten by birds. So when I ask you to make a pyramid, you'll make a pyramid that will look something like this. Obviously, the grass is going to be the greatest in terms of number, right? The grass is going to be the greatest in terms of number. The grass is going to have the highest count. Then, after grass, the number of, if we take a look at the number of organisms. So clearly, if we just look at this example, obviously, after the grass, we're going to have grasshoppers. Okay, grasshoppers are going to have the second highest number. Frogs, obviously, frogs are going to have a smaller number. And birds, they're going to be even less birds than frogs. So this is one way that the scientists can study an ecosystem. When they're making a pyramid, one of the pyramids they can make is a pyramid of number. At each trophic level, they take a look at the number of organisms and they make a pyramid using that information. But there's a problem with this. A pyramid of numbers is not a very good representation of the ecosystem. Why? To explain this, I'm going to give you another example of chain. Okay. Imagine we have an example that's something like this. We have an oak tree. That oak tree, on it, we've got insects that are your aphids. Okay. Aphids are insects that are known to drink the tree sap. Aphids are going to be eaten by insects that are ladybirds. And ladybirds are eaten by birds. Now, this time, if I ask you, okay, Viraj, can you please draw the number of organisms for me, or you make the pyramid for me, what will you do? The oak tree is going to actually be the smallest, right? The oak tree is actually going to be the smallest. The reason the oak tree is going to be the smallest is because on one oak tree, you can have millions of aphids, right? On that one oak tree, you can have hundreds of birds. On that one oak tree, you can have thousands of ladybirds. So oak trees act, there's only one oak tree. But on that one oak tree, we have got billions of aphids. Those billions of aphids are being eaten by hundreds of ladybirds. Those hundreds of ladybirds are being eaten by many birds. Now, this does not look like a very good pyramid, does it? I mean, the oak tree over here, there's just one oak tree. This does not look like a pyramid. A pyramid should be wide at the bottom and narrow at the top. This does not look like a pyramid. The oak trees, there's only one oak tree, right? So this is the problem with pyramid of numbers. It's not a very accurate representation. It does not give you a very accurate result, okay? But why? Because it is very much possible that there's only one producer and there are a lot of consumers. So pyramid of numbers, yes, one of the ways to study our ecology, but not always reliable. Okay. Then the second method that is actually used by the scientists that is actually reliable is the pyramid of biomass. Okay. This is the second option, that instead of making a pyramid of numbers, we make a pyramid of biomass. What is biomass? Biomass is basically the dry mass of an organism. If I take an organism, I remove all of the I basically take an organism and I basically measure all the total mass of the organisms in each trophic level. So I measure the total mass of the tree, the total mass of the aphids, ladybird birds. So once I measure the total mass of all of these, I can make a pyramid of biomass. Now, I'm going to take the same example, okay? I'm going to take the same example and we are going to see what a pyramid of biomass would look like. So in a pyramid of biomass, we take the total mass of the living organisms at each trophic level. Okay, so that means that if I try to make over here, obviously, even though there is one oak tree, but the mass of that one oak tree is going to be it's going to be a lot, right? Then if I take those billions and billions of aphids and I add up all of their masses, they're going to be slightly lesser than the mass of the oak tree. The ladybirds are obviously going to have even less mass, even though they're bigger, but their numbers are much smaller. So they're going to have less mass, right? And the birds are going to be the least in number. So when we will add the mass of all the birds, we will get a smaller mass, right? So one oak tree but the mass of the oak tree is going to be the greatest. Those aphids that are on the oak tree are going to have a slightly lesser mass. Compared to birds, the total mass of aphids is more. Why? Because birds are much lesser in number, right? If we have birds, then in one oak tree we might have 5, 6 birds, as compared to billions of aphids, right, or thousands of aphids. So we can use a pyramid of biomass. A pyramid of biomass is the more accurate way of studying the ecosystem. Okay. So now when we are talking about this pyramid, okay, if you remember, we had discussed that I told you that the maximum number of consumers that we can have is usually quaternary, right? We don't usually have more than 4 consumers. So we can have producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and then we can have quaternary consumer. Okay. But that's usually it. We do not have more than quaternary consumers, or we don't have more than 5 trophic level. Okay. Producer, first, second, third, fourth. That's the 5 trophic levels. So generally we only have up to 5 trophic levels. Why is that? The reason for that is because of energy transfer. Okay. Remember this. Energy is lost between each trophic level. So between each trophic level, energy is lost. What does that mean? That means that let's say that the grass is being eaten by the grasshopper. Okay. Not all of the energy, not all of the energy possessed by the grass will transfer to the grasshopper. Similarly, the grasshopper is being eaten by birds. Okay, let's say. So not all of I think we took the example of ladybirds. So not all of the energy that the grasshopper has is going to be transferred into the ladybirds. Why is that? Okay. Why is it that energy is lost between each trophic level? The reason for that is, let's say that the grasshopper has eaten the grass. The energy it obtains from the grass will be used for metabolism, right? For the chemical reactions in the body, it's going to be used up for that. It's going to be used for movement. It's going to be used for respiration. It's going to be used. It's going to be used for metabolism, for movements, for respiration. A big portion of it is going to be excreted from the body, removed from the body as the form of waste products, excretion, right? Other than that, we some parts of the plant are not eaten or not digested. So for example, maybe the grasshopper is only eating the leaves of the grass and not the roots of the grass. So again, the energy stored in the roots of the grass is not really getting to the grasshopper. So in this process, a lot of the energy is actually lost. Okay. So the energy stored in the grasshopper is significantly less. Okay. Uh this is the reason why one ladybird may need to eat 3, 4 grasshoppers to get the energy it needs, right? Because the energy that is going from the grass to the grasshopper. So again, all the energy possessed by the grass is not getting to the grasshopper. Why? Because the grasshopper is not going to eat all the parts of the grass. Then When it does eat the grass, whatever energy it gets, it's going to lose it. Metabolism, movement, respiration, excretion, carbon dioxide, in all forms, that energy is being lost. Only a little bit of that energy is actually going to be stored inside the grasshopper. That grasshopper, when it's going to be eaten by the ladybird, again, ladybird is going to get ladybird is going to be it's going to also lose that energy in the again, it's not going to get all the energy from the grasshopper. Grasshopper already has less energy compared to grass because it lost a lot of it in the form of metabolism and all that, right? Then whatever energy it does possess, the ladybird won't even get that. It's going to get even less than what grasshopper ended up with, because the ladybird is also because the amount of energy stored in the grasshopper is quite small, right? Then when the ladybird is now this ladybird is also going to lose energy. It's also going to have metabolism, movement, respiration, excretion, all of that. So that ladybird is also going to lose energy. So when the bird is going to eat the ladybird, it's going to receive even less energy. So you can see that between each trophic level, the energy is decreasing. If grass had 100% energy, then ultimately the bird is only receiving 10% of it, for example. Okay. So at each trophic level, energy is being lost. That is why a ladybird might need to eat 5 grasshoppers to get the energy it needs. A bird might need to eat 15 to 20 ladybirds to get the energy it needs, for example. Okay. And that is also why the numbers decrease as the trophic levels change. Okay. So this is why we do not have more than 4 consumers. Because by the time, for example, let's say that the bird is being eaten by a cat. It's a sparrow. The sparrow is being eaten by a cat, for example. Now, what happens that when you talk about the cat, so the cat, at this point, the amount of energy that the cat is receiving is so small that it just cannot sustain another consumer. There is not enough energy at the fourth consumer, at the quaternary consumer trophic level. There is just not enough energy available to sustain a whole different consumer, a whole different trophic level. Okay. That's why generally in the ecosystem, we only have up to quaternary consumer or total 5 trophic levels. So in each trophic level, energy is going to be lost. Making sense?
Yes.
Perfect. So generally speaking, between each trophic level, around 10% of the energy is actually transferred. So from the grass to the grasshopper, only 10% of the energy is transferred. Then whatever energy the grasshopper has, only 10% of it goes to the ladybird. Okay. So that's the general like estimate I believe that the scientist made, that only 10% of it is actually going to go from one trophic level to another. Okay. Now, when we are going to go ahead and we're going to talk about it. Another important thing that we have to discuss is the interaction of organisms in an ecosystem. Okay. Now, the way any organisms exist in an ecosystem depends on a wide variety of things. Okay. Now, whenever we're studying an ecosystem and we're studying the interaction between organisms, there are a few factors that we have to consider. Okay. Now, one of the factors that you are often going to find yourself discussing is competition. Organisms compete with each other for resources. Okay. So they will compete for food, because food is a limited resource. So organisms are always going to be competing with each other for food. They will be competing with each other for shelter. They will be competing with each other for mates. They will be competing with each other for water, right? They will be okay. So if we talk about the survival of any species, okay, the number of a species in an area or the survival of a species in an area depends upon the competition. Okay. So what happens is that you have got, let's say, two species of birds living in an area. Hmm? What is going to happen that some now both of the birds are the amount of water is limited. The amount of food, the amount of seeds they're eating is limited. The habitat, the trees that they live in, they're all limited. So both of them are going to be competing with each other, right? So now what is going to happen that let's say that one species of the bird is got an advantage. Okay, they are better at fighting. They're better at hunting and getting to the seeds. Or they, they so those birds are going to have a better chance of surviving compared to the other species, right? So the number of species depends upon the competition. The survival of species depends upon the competition. Okay. So what is the competition going to be? Whenever we're studying an ecosystem, we have to take a look at the competition, right? Then the second way organisms interact with each other is through feeding, right? Organisms are feeding on each other to recycle the nutrients among the system. We studied this. We discussed this before as well. The grass is going to be eaten by the goat. The goat will be eaten by the lion. The lion will die, and the decomposers will return the nutrients back to the soil. So the cycle continues. The same nutrients are going to be recycled throughout the ecosystem, right? Then we also discussed that the organisms are going to be interacting with their physical environment. Okay. Okay. So they're also going to be interacting with their physical environment, right? For example, plants will absorb nutrients from the soil, right? Now, the survival of the plant or a plant species is going to depend upon the soil conditions, the quality of the soil, the nutrients that are available, right? It's going to depend upon the it's going to depend upon the amount of oxygen, amount of carbon dioxide. It's going to depend upon the amount of light intensity. It's going to depend upon the water vapor, right? All of these things. All of these physical factors can have an effect on the survival of a particular species. Similarly, when we talk about animals, right? The animals are affected by temperature. If the temperature of an area becomes too cold or too hot, it can affect the survival of an animal species. Um, the any extreme weather conditions, any changes in the geographical area, right? if there's a sudden change in the geographical area, if their habitat is destroyed, if there is a sudden flood, all of these things can have an effect on the survival of an animal species. So whenever we're studying an organism, we're studying the survival of an organism in an environment, we always have to look at certain factors, okay? Because organisms compete with each other, organisms feed into each other, organisms are affected by their physical environment. So if we want to understand any ecosystem, we have to take a look at all of these factors, okay? Now when we talk about factors, factors can be divided. So if we talk about factors affecting a ecosystem, so factors affecting an ecosystem can be divided into two categories. We can either have biotic factors or abiotic factors, right? We discussed this previously as well. Biotic factors are living factors, and abiotic factors are the non-living factors like your physical environment. Now, let me list down all the possible biotic factors that you have to consider in your answer. Availability of food. Availability of food and competition for resources. Predation. Predation means that how many predators of that species are there, right? A species that does not have a natural predator is likely to, grow unchecked. If let's say there's an ecosystem and I introduce a predator on it, so obviously that predator is going to, let's say there's an ecosystem in which we have rabbits, okay? There is no predators for rabbit in that specific ecosystem, but I decide to introduce the a predator for the rabbit. I decide to introduce lions or hyena or whatever, okay? Now what is going to happen that those predators are going to start affecting the number of rabbits in that area. The number of when the number of rabbits are going to reduce, so the rabbits feed on plants, so the plants will start to grow unchecked, right? Any other animal species that competes with rabbit, okay? Any other animal species that competes with rabbit will start to grow unchecked, right? So the ecosystem starts to change. So the ecosystem is affected by predation, it is affected by food, it is affected by competition, it is affected by diseases. If there is a particular disease that is attacking one species only, that will affect the overall ecosystem. Remember that ecosystem, a food web, they're all interlinked with each other. One thing gets affected, everything changes, right? um Parasites. If there is a parasite destroying one particular plant species, the entire ecosystem gets affected. Every organism who eats on those plants will start to die because they won't be able to eat those plants. The secondary consumers will also be affected because the primary consumers are reducing in number, right? So all of these are like a chain reaction, right? They all affect each other. Then the availability of shelter. All of these are biotic factors that can affect a possible species. Then we can, or a ecosystem. Then we have abiotic factors, okay? In abiotic factors we have climate. So in climate we can talk about light intensity, right? We can talk about the temperature. So for example, if there is a sudden temperature change in a pond, it goes to a very high temperature. All of the aquatic animals inside that pond are going to be affected, right? Which is going to affect the ecosystem overall. Availability of water, right? Then we have to consider our hours of daylight. Okay. So for example, in those areas where we do not have that much daylight, right? The daylight varies. Some areas the day is quite long, some areas the day is quite short. So that can also affect the plant species that are growing that area and affect the overall ecosystem. Soil conditions, right? Soil conditions can also affect an ecosystem. So what is the soil quality? What is the pH of the soil? What is the particle size? Okay, some soils have the ability of holding onto a lot of water. Okay, now for some plants that is good, for some plants that is bad because the roots get suffocated. Some soil can have very loose particles, so it basically holds onto no water whatsoever. Again, that can actually be bad for certain plants because they are because they're not going to get enough water. So soil quality is important, right? Water content, nitrate level, nutrition level inside the soil, all of these can affect the amount, the plants that are going, and as a result the entire ecosystem, right? Pollution. Now, why am I going over this with you? Because when we are going to go over past paper questions, so on this topic, generally, you get a bit of theoretical based questions. They'll give you a scenario, they'll give you an ecosystem, and they will ask you, about why do you think that the number of organisms or this species in the area was affected, right? And in that case you will be looking at all of these factors. So this is, you can learn these factors, but you're not going to be asked to list them like this. The way I'm listing them for you, you're not going to be asked to list them like that. The questions are theoretical. They'll ask you, why do you think that the number of this species was affected in this ecosystem? So you are going to look at all of these factors at that point. You're going to say, okay, one possibility is predation. So you go over the scenario given in the question and you see, is there any mention of predation? Is there any mention of availability of food? So you'll identify in the scenario that in the scenario it is mentioned that there was a possible predation going on or predator was introduced. So you'll start your answer from there, right? So that's how you're going to be dealing with all of this. So, you'll take a look at the food supply, right? So this is basically when I'm giving you these things, the reason I'm giving you is this, is because these are all the factors that are affecting it. So when you're solving your past paper questions and you're asked theoretically to identify why did this happen, why do you think the organism of species of this organism reduced, you'll see a lot of graph-based questions on this, right? So they'll give you graph of the number of the species. They'll ask you to elaborate on the graph, talk about the graph, and they'll ask you, why do you think the number of organisms was affected? So that is when you're going to look at this list and try to identify which of these factors can be the possible cause. Making sense? Any part that's not clear?
No.
Okay. So now these sometimes, Viraj, you will have to also think a little bit out of the box. Okay. For example, there's some factors that are specific to a certain habitat, right? For example, if you're talking about a river, then flow rate can be a concern, right? The cloudiness of the water, water pollution, the concentration of minerals in the ions, the pH of the water, right? So these are things you will think for a water supply or a water habitat, but you're not going to be worried about the flow rate. For example, the flow rate of the water. Yes, if you're dealing with a pond ecosystem, you can think about the flow rate, you can think about the depth of the water, but you're not going to be thinking about the depth of the water in a rainforest, right? So some factors are dependent on the habitat as well. So sometimes, occasionally, when you're answering questions, you can also try to think out of the box. Try to think of some factors that are only specific to that certain habitat and not, that would not be found in any other possible habitat. So you can also look at those factors instead of this. Okay. But those factors are habitat specific. So you will just have to think out of the box when solving that question. Okay. Okay, Viraj, we'll go ahead. We'll stop it over here for today. In our next class, we'll talk about a little bit about the nutrient cycle, right? So you have your nitrogen cycle. We'll go ahead and we'll talk a little bit about our nutrient cycle. And actually, I think that's about it. Yeah, I think we're done with the topic of ecology. We also have like in we also have another topic related to ecology, which is your human effect on the environment and all that. But in ecology, we're just left with the nutrient cycle. So what we're going to go in that is we're going to finish off this topic in the next class, and we will then start taking a look at a few questions on the topic. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Viraj. I'll see you in the next class then. Have a good day.